My name is Frances Withrow, and I am a scientist at Oceana. I started working here about just a little over 3 years ago in 2017. And before that, I had worked as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines, working on coastal resource management. And before that, I got my degrees in applied mathematics for my undergrad and wildlife and fisheries for my master's from Texas A&M University. I think that is a great question. And my first answer is that fisheries is a very complex industry. There are so many rights holders and stakeholders, and fish themselves are really challenging. So when it comes to the people who are involved, they have very different values and have very different goals. So sometimes it's related to cultural importance, historical communities who have been fishing for a long time and it's really important to them. Sometimes it's economic. The fishery is really important for them to make money, or it can kind of link to their cultural needs. They consume that fish and it's very important for their health. There's political issues, right? Sometimes politicians who, again, they're usually supposed to only care about the people they're representing, but sometimes it's a form of power. And then there's economic and biological issues. Those fish are important because they are a part of an ecosystem. No matter what fishery it is a part of a whole system. So that being said, fish move and they're really hard to measure. Not to hate on my terrestrial scientist counterparts, they have huge challenges too. It's very hard to find sloths or worms or anything like that. But fish pose their own challenge because humans don't live underwater and fish move a lot. And so knowing just how many there are and where they move and why and how can be really challenging to understand. So all of that combined creates a very complex problem. And some of the specific underlying mechanisms for those problems can range from a lack of regulation. So for example, the Law of the Sea, established by the UN, was only established in the 1980s. And what that does is it gives different nations their exclusive economic zone, which means they have the rights to that area surrounding their nation. And so that was only established in the 80s. So before that, it was a free-for-all. If you had the boats, you could go fish wherever you want, and nobody could really do anything about it. Now, some people did, they'd have their own power and tell people to go away, but which leads to also another underlying issue is colonialism. This is a problem we've been talking a lot more in the United States recently, but it is a problem everywhere in the world. Places that are overexploited, like Western Africa, off the coast of Western Africa, is often because of colonialism. A lot of the fishing there is from foreign nations. And in fact, some studies even show that 40% of the landed catch in Western Africa is illegal fishing. And sometimes it's also legal, but it has to do with corruption and power. So it's like I'm not being specific only because it's hard to be specific because there are so many aspects to it. Another problem that I already mentioned is that fish are hard to monitor. There are fisheries that have a lot of data, and you can still do science-based fisheries management with little data, but you need some. So if I tell you to, be better at fishing for sardines, it's hard to know what that means. If I don't know, how many sardines are being caught, who's catching them, how many people are catching them, where are they catching them? And the smallest amount of information can still make a big impact, but you need something to work with, and it costs money to get that information. Another problem is harmful fisheries subsidies. This is a problem everywhere, but especially in high seas fisheries. So high seas are all the areas that are not in exclusive economic zones. The most relatable one is tuna. Most tuna are caught, not most tuna, but many tuna are caught outside of EEZs, and so they're considered high seas fisheries. So many of these fisheries aren't even profitable, they're subsidized. And they're either subsidized directly by governments who are profiting from them or in the form of forced or slave labor. You'll hear these articles about human trafficking and forced labor, and there are many examples of it, but you often hear it in high seas situations because those vessels are out for really long periods of time and they're really hard to monitor because they're far away and they're not under the responsibility of any one nation. So, and I only touched on a lot of the problems and challenges. So that's not to say that there isn't some hope, but it's a big problem that's influenced by a lot of things, not excluding climate change. In terms of globally, the most used data sets are from the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, or Sea Around Us. The FAO collects global information about fisheries catch, and then the Sea Around Us data set uses both that information, but then also reconstructs what they suspected fish catch. So that is helpful because some countries will have very specific studies that are done either by scientists or by the national government, and Sea Around Us tries to incorporate that data into their global catch information. And all that being said, even though those data sets are slightly different in terms of raw amount, they both show that our global fish catch peaked in the 90s. Now, there's some debate about whether or not that fish catch is declining or kind of remaining the same. It is challenging because we have more information and there's data bias and things like that. But everyone does agree that our fish catch peaked in the 90s. People are working just as hard, if not harder, to get fish, but there are not fish to be had. I think many people don't understand that phytoplankton, the smallest species on the planet, in the ocean create 50% of our oxygen. So terrestrial systems create the other 50%, and the ocean creates the last part. And so extreme changes to phytoplankton, these species that people don't know what they look like, they don't really know what they do, they don't understand that there's thousands of species of phytoplankton, are really the basis of life for all of us. And changes to the ocean are really, I don't want to say challenging their existence, that's a little too alarmist, but it's impacting them. It's changing which species are there. When some live or some die, that impacts the things that eat them, and that's a whole chain effect that, you know, if one species is disappearing and then a small fish eats that species, they either have to move or they die. And then that is a chain effect all the way to the biggest things, which include things like tuna, whales, and even people. So it's hard to relate, but we're all connected to it. And then I also think that you aren't necessarily being colonialist for not knowing it exists or necessarily having an emotional connection, but it is important to address that a lot of the places that will be most significantly impacted in a negative way by climate change are those exact places that have been exploited historically, either by directly getting those resources that are getting depleted or in other ways that make it more challenging for them to have resources to manage. I'm going to start with an example that I promise is related. And so if you think about yourself or your friend or any person, and they get a cold or even a physical wound, like a cut on their hand, and then they're left to heal, if they are physically healthy and in a safe place, they will heal faster and probably be okay. But then if you add other stressors, whether it's that they don't have any food to eat, they're malnourished, or they don't have shelter and they're cold or they're very hot, or they are in a situation where they're unsafe, like let's go back to, you know, the dark ages or something where you're being chased by a lion, you know, again, a little dramatic, but just as an example, keeping in mind that if you have one stress, often you can bounce back from it and sometimes may not even be stressed out by that one stress. It's very manageable. You hardly even notice it. But if you have additional stressors, it'll be harder and harder and harder for you to not only bounce back from it, but potentially even survive. And I think that is also important to consider for fisheries in general. So say we have a fishery and we have really overfished it and the fish stock is really depleted, but we notice it and we decide to rebuild that fishery and either drastically reduce the amount of fish we catch or stop catching it at all. That fishery can bounce back. Now that is in a very secluded system. So let's say that fish eats a specific type of plankton, and for whatever reason, all of those plankton are not doing so great, either because they're not getting enough light or something. So now that fish is both struggling because it is getting caught and murdered by people for consumption or for fun, not to hate on the recreational fisheries, they're important too, and it can't find food. So that's making it even harder. So now add climate change. The temperature is changing and the ocean is more acidic, just to name two of the things that can happen. So now it can't even survive in the place that it's used to, it has to migrate. So I say that to say that, you know, we are adding a lot of stressors to the ocean, and it is getting harder and harder and harder for different species to either survive or bounce back in a way that we expect. And the way that impacts the tropics is that the tropics is already the hottest part of the world. And historically, it's okay that it's warm. The species there are made for that heat. But as the oceans are warming more and more and more, the species there have never experienced those temperatures at that level in their life, because the changes of temperature globally and in geologic scale are slower versus the type of heat change that we are incorporating now. So It's not to say that some species aren't evolving. I know that that is an argument and a methodology to try and say coral species, to try and get them to evolve faster to survive such temperatures. But generally speaking, that is not normally the time scale that they can adjust. So things in the tropics either have to move farther to the poles or they die. So, coral species can't really move. They, in their polyp stage do float and try to find different places. And so in some ways there is seeding of coral reefs that can expand, but that's not how corals work. They, sit in one spot and then create skeletons and create a coral reef. And so that being said, a lot of the temperate zones will also suffer from this, but a lot of the species are going to be moving towards the poles. So places that are in temperate zones or even Arctic zones won't see as many problems as the tropics will, because nobody is trying to seek warmer waters, because no species has experienced this temperature before. And that's not even to start talking about the things with storms. Again, all places experience different types of natural weather events, but it's places in the tropics that are really impacted by things like typhoons and hurricanes. And there is debate about whether or not, the frequency or intensity is increasing, but most people agree that the frequency and intensity of storms is increasing because there is a higher temperature, which gives the storm system more energy, which is also impacting ecosystems and the fish themselves, because obviously species can die in the storm, but it's also important to remember that those storms destroy habitat. They destroy coral reefs, seagrass, and mangroves, which fish and invertebrate species live in. I do have to be a little general because it definitely depends on the place. So keep in mind that my answer doesn't necessarily apply to everywhere, but it can be a huge problem. One thing that can happen is that alternative foods, sometimes it's not protein, it is just calories, which keep in mind, calories do not always equate nutrition. Other forms of protein or calories that are cheaper are less healthy. So sometimes what happens is that even if they have access to the fish, they would rather, it is more beneficial for them to sell that source of nutrition to then buy more food, buy more calories. And again, it's not always true, but in many cases, it can be that source of calories is either less protein or overall less nutritious for them or whoever they're providing for. Another thing that can happen is that those people have to move. And I think most people would agree that if due to natural disasters or natural causes, major migrations create a lot of conflict. I think it's a natural thing. Nobody's necessarily even a bad guy, but if you're moving a lot of people in a very short period of time, it creates a lot of conflict. And that in itself is a challenge without even thinking about sources of food in that challenge, whether or not they're going somewhere that also has enough food to share with people, or if that place is also struggling, but maybe less. A good example would be specifically forage fisheries. So forage fisheries are fish that include sardines, anchovies, any of the small silverfish. And there's a lot of them in the world, and they're highly nutritious. However, most people would be really shocked to know that a large proportion of that fishery people don't eat. It goes into creating animal feed for other fish in aquaculture or land animals like livestock. And I have a hard time with this topic because some people get very defensive when talking about the climate impacts of different proteins. And I'm not really advocating that you should only eat, fish or only eat vegetarian proteins, as much as evaluating the impact of the different sources of protein or nutrition and really think about what that's doing to the world. Because it's almost sad that a huge proportion of this highly nutritious fish that people could be eating locally gets shipped all over the world to either feed other fish, so you're just feeding another fish, or livestock. And also in the form of the oil pills, you can get the fish oil pills. So that's not to say that those industries are inherently bad or that we shouldn't be doing that. It's just that we should think about how much we're doing it. People will rag on beef a lot, and I agree, beef. Sorry, all those beef eaters. I'm from Texas. I also still love beef, but it is terrible for the environment. It has the worst land, water, and greenhouse gas impact. But you can still eat beef, but eat less of it and be more conscious and change that industry. And furthermore, when you're talking about policies, which Oceana cares about, and we do not work on this, but as a general statement, we can make sure we aren't subsidizing industries that are actively harmful. many of the times when we prioritize different industries, it's only about economics and the culture of what people want to eat, and we don't necessarily place a monetary value on the economic output, or excuse me, on the environmental output. And it leads back to why do people care? And again, it's fine if it's not people's number one thing. We only have a limited capacity to have things that we're passionate about, but I do think we have capacity to be conscious of things we care about and things we consume. And so if you ever eat fish or really eat anything that eats off of fish, I think it's important to know that it exists and that a lot of people need it. And so even if you aren't somebody who directly consumes fish, knowing that potentially the things you buy, this even leads to plastic pollution. We touch plastic all day and every day, and it's also a very complicated problem. But we can be more conscious of the things we do, because almost always it ultimately impacts the ocean. We have so much information that says that can and will happen. If we don't manage our fisheries, we do not have to argue that we can cause species to go extinct. We can make permanent, permanent, unchangeable differences to the ocean that will impact us forever, that we can never go back to the way it was before. We don't get a restart, if you will. There's no save point. It'll be changed forever. But that being said, so it's important to use that information so that people pay attention, that politicians pay attention, and people who are involved can listen. However, I do want to say that there is lots of hope. One, if we band together, especially places that are producing most of the greenhouse gases, like the United States, really work to reduce their emissions, we can slow the change. Most of the time when you read scientific papers that look at projections, they do always include both the super extreme bad version, but also the version that says we got our stuff together, we reduced emissions, and we made a change. And things are still on a trajectory to be bad. So it is important to emphasize that even if we stopped our greenhouse gas emissions, we are on a trend right now that we can't go back. However, if we do that, we can rebuild. And we already have examples of fisheries that have been rebuilt. Like, we can change our behavior that impacts the ecosystem in a tangible way. So in that way, it's annoying because we don't have a timeline. And if you ever do see a thing that says there will be no fish by 2050 or something like that, I find that a little frustrating because, the side that is anti-management, or for whatever reason, tries to say that this isn't a big deal, they'll use that to say environmentalists are being alarmist. And I understand it's very frustrating to get information that is confusing. But we don't need the timeline to know that our trajectory, even if we don't know what year it will be, is not heading in a good place without some intervention. So there is hope. We don't know when. It depends on a lot of things because fisheries are really complicated. But we are not, without drastic change, both for climate change and fisheries management, we are not necessarily headed to a place where we will get to eat the same fish that we're used to. Often people will pit environmentalists against the economists, and I don't like that narrative. I think many cases there is a win-win, because keep in mind that if a fishery is depleted, that is bad for the economy. People are making money off of that. Sometimes it's about people's food and safety, which I think should be important, but if we're going to go cold numbers and we care about short-term profits, oftentimes it's more profitable to keep the fishery sustainable, because obviously you will not be making money off of that fishery if it crashes and you can no longer fish it. So I do want to point out that, it is complicated. People aren't always malicious, but we have to keep in mind long-term trends. So maybe that was a misphrase. Short-term profits are usually better to fish it all out, but even long-term, only up to 10 years, again, talking about scales, it's often more profitable to obviously keep the fishery in business. It can be challenging because it's okay to have different goals, but often the conversations, at least in the United States, I don't want to speak for other places, can become very antagonistic. Like, we don't have the same goal. And it's when it comes to, say, reducing, say a fishery is depleted and we need to stop fishing for a period of time to rebuild the fishery, it's totally reasonable that people in that fishery are stressed out because they won't have a livelihood. And so rather than turning it into only the people fishing or the fish win, we can come up with solutions that say, no, we want you to stay in this fishery, but we have to take a break. So let's talk about alternative livelihoods or programs. Even if they have to leave the fishery, let's talk about ways that we can have you enter another industry, whether it's fishing or something else. I think if people really know that we are trying to have the same mindset of long-term sustainable fisheries with the goal to create livelihood and provide nutrition and protein, as well as support traditional cultural values, then we can come up with solutions that, again, not everyone will win just because that's the nature of things, but people can understand the outcome and be on board. One that is very exciting is in the United States for many years to increase the transparency of fisheries management. We've been advocating for a program now called the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, which is gearing up for implementation right now. And part of that stemmed from some studies we did that investigated seafood fraud. So what that means is that we were concerned that fish that people were buying were either very generically labeled, so as a consumer, you didn't know what you're getting, or in fact was mislabeled. Again, I don't want to emphasize that it's always malicious. Sometimes it's an accident, and it's just a case of the system not being very efficient. And in those studies, so for example, some fish that were labeled grouper was a very generic label. And in a specific study, we found after doing DNA tests of those samples that they were as many as 64 different species. So anything labeled grouper could have been 64 potential different fish. And of those 64 fish, 36% of them were at risk of extinction. So I feel like as consumers, we don't really want to buy something that not only do we not know what it is, but it's potentially really harmful to the environment. I think it's first important to highlight that Oceana's mission is to restore and protect ocean abundance. So we label our work as campaigns, but what that means is that each campaign focuses on a national level policy outcome that we believe will lead to restoring or protecting ocean abundance. These campaigns typically focus on stopping overfishing, protecting habitat, reducing bycatch, curbing pollution, and increasing transparency, because we believe these things lead to what our mission is, which is restoring and protecting ocean abundance. That being said, we focus on national level policies. So we hope to address the most pressing needs of fisheries management and ocean conservation, but we also reflect on the political moment. Each nation has different political trends and timelines, and talking about scale, biology and ecology have different timescales, and so do politics, and those vary for each country. So we try to take all of these into consideration when we consider a different campaign. And when we are doing that, we also want to make sure that our policies are science and fact-based. We do care about, if you will, the emotional side of it. People care about the ocean. It's very important to them. But we also want to make sure that we have information to support that. We don't just choose campaigns because they're popular or we think they feel nice. There are specific reasons. And so even if we try to appeal to people's emotion of caring about turtles, we also know that turtles are ecologically and economically important to the world for tourism, and the things they eat are a part of a total food web. And so we make sure to incorporate a lot of science into our different policy goals. So what I first want to say is just do your best. I'm here to advocate for Oceana, but I will say that if you find an organization that is more directly improving or impacting the thing you care about, then you can donate to it. I think donating to Oceana is really effective because our methodology is very specific. That's not to say that we don't depend on our other partner organizations to do different parts of problem solving. I talked about how this problem is very complex and therefore requires different people to work on different parts of it. We very much focus on fact-based, national-based policy. So we try to do the biggest bang for your buck, if you will. We target nations that have some of the largest fish catches by country in the world, so that we can say improving fisheries management here does have an impact on the global fisheries. And so in that way, I think we are very effective at what we do, and would very much, I'm biased, encourage people to donate to our cause. But I don't like saying, if you don't give to certain places that you aren't doing a good job. Different people are doing different things. And I don't think it should be us against them. I think we should all collaborate and make sure that, we're conscious of what we're doing, we do research. It's not lazy, or we don't just give to the first person who comes to us, because some people aren't necessarily being truthful in what they're doing, or necessarily impacting the things that you want in the ways you think they are. But I do encourage everyone to support Oceana. That can also include things like following our different Instagram accounts. We post beautiful photos. We have Twitter accounts, Facebook, all those types of things. And they're all over the world. We have offices all around the world. So even if you're not interested in our international accounts, which are also fabulous, you can follow our different country accounts. I think there are different narratives about how you can make impact, and some of them focus on everyday lifestyle, you making different decisions to improve the world. And then there is a larger scale systematic change. And sometimes those narratives can combat each other, but I think they actually complement each other. I do want to provide an example before I continue. When it comes to plastic pollution, some people will say, really put the impetus on the user. Say, you have to find things that are plastic free. It's your fault that there's more plastic. And I do find that as a consumer, when I buy stuff, it is a vote. It is a vote for that product. I'm supporting that company. However, I don't have a lot of choices when it comes to finding alternatives. And that is not my fault or your fault in any way. That is a systematic problem. And that's when it comes to doing systematic change, holding different companies accountable, because they are literally producing trash. In the United States, we really focus on a capitalist culture. We care about buying. So I'm constantly getting advertised at, told to buy these things. I listened to them and bought this product, but now it's somehow my fault that I have trash. So I want to highlight that you do have a choice in some cases. You reaching out to people or supporting small businesses and buying a slightly more expensive product that's plastic free does make a difference, but it's two pathways to create a better change. And in that context, when it comes to donations, you may think $5 doesn't have an impact. And if it's by itself, of course it doesn't. I don't want to be mean, but what does $5 buy you in the long run? But you have to keep in mind that your donation is a small piece of a larger sum. And not only is that a monetary thing, but it's also the influence. Even if you don't tell everybody that you donated to Oceana, there is someone in your life that knows that you are donating money, and it can inspire them to also donate money, not necessarily to Oceana, but to things they care about, or, institutions that are making good change. And I think lots of people don't give themselves credit for the influence they have on their community. You trying to just do your best in the ways you can, because again, sometimes you can't even donate money. Sometimes it comes to the impact of following a page or sharing something on Instagram. Some people will trivialize that, and I don't want to over romanticize social media, but it also has an impact because your community sees it and they see that you care about something, and maybe it'll make them think about it too. And so even the smallest interactions, the smallest donations do make a big difference. And I only use that earlier example to say, I don't want to always put the impetus on the common layperson, because sometimes it is systematic issues and it is not fair to put all the pressure on people who aren't necessarily making policies. But we still have power. We are the consumers, we are the voters. And so anything you do is a vote all day, every day, and it makes a difference, no matter how small.